This is an Apple Power Macintosh 9600/300, a behemoth desktop computer released in mid-1997. And this is a copy of LinuxPPC 1999. The Power Macintosh 9600 was Apple's top-of-the-line desktop powerhouse upon its release in early 1997. I was lucky enough to use one of these desktops as a kid in my photo-video classes. In fact, I first learned video editing on a machine just like this back in high school. This model, the 9600/300, was a mid-97 upgrade boasting a whopping 300 MHz PowerPC 604 EV on a swappable daughter card. That's right, these were user serviceable. The 9600's motherboard has no onboard video, so Apple shipped these with a twin-turbo 128 PCI GPU, which carried a blistering 8 MB of onboard video RAM. On my 9600, I've installed an early 2000s ATI Radeon 7000 card, which a patron of mine flashed for Apple devices and graciously donated to the channel. The previous owner of this 9600 had upgraded the RAM to 256 MB, up from the stock 64, and I replaced the ancient spinning disk SCSI hard drive with a Blue SCSI in order to make backups and file transfers easier. Blue SCSI is an open-source, Pi-based drive emulator for SCSI devices, and I swear if one of you cracks a joke about the Pi being more powerful than the rest of the PC, I'ma turn this car around. My long-term goal for this machine is to recreate my very first AV editing rig from high school. And the Blue SCSI, which I paid for with my own money, helps make software transfers easier than ever before. But today, we're exploring turn-of-the-century Linux on this beast. So why Linux, you ask? Well, for one, it's fun, and that's a good enough reason. Moving on. Imagine it's the late 1990s. While x86-based Intel processors and their clones were dominating everything on the PC side, Apple was chugging along with their PowerPC processors, developed in conjunction with Motorola and IBM. And those weren't even the only two options in the computing space. You still had stuff like MIPS from SGI and Spark from Sun. Compared with today, it was the Wild West. And it wasn't clear that any one architecture was going to win. Porting Linux to new architectures was a given even back in the 1990s, just like it is today. Of course, folks were putting in the work to get Linux running on Apple's PowerPC-based machines. And you gotta remember, it wasn't even a given that Apple would be a company for much longer. Apple co-founder and proprietary screwdriver enthusiast, Steve Jobs, returned to the company in the midst of the lifespan of this 9600. And he was taking plenty of risks and making big changes at Apple. With hindsight, we know that his gambles paid off for the company. But to your average sysadmin in the late 90s, the jury was still out. And with all that context, it makes sense that folks were throwing Linux around as a plausible option for this hardware. Particularly since even in the 90s, Linux made a pretty sweet server. With a simple point-and-click installer, you can get FTP, Samba, or even Apache going. If you were connecting a small office and had access to a 9600, this is a totally reasonable way to keep using it, even if Apple quit supporting it. The distro for today's escapades is called LinuxPPC 1999, a commercial release that forked Red Hat's 5.0 release to the PowerPC architecture, produced by LinuxPPC Inc. from Waukesha, Wisconsin. LinuxPPC 1999 was freely available via the company website. But due to the difficulties with downloading distros in the dire days of dial-up, a physical CD was available for just $32. $129 with an office suite, apparently. LinuxPPC put out a few more releases after this, and eventually re-registered as a non-profit before its staff moved on to other organizations sometime in the mid-2000s. Which makes sense since, as the decade went on, it became clear that PowerPC wasn't going to win the day. One of those founders, Jeffrey Carr, went on to co-found cloud provider DigitalOcean, which I think is kind of neat, and LinuxPPC Inc. is a topic I'd love to explore in a future video. For now, enough of the history lesson. Let's get Linux installed. I'm using BlueSCSI to emulate 2 drives, a clean install of macOS 9.1, as well as a blank second drive where our Linux distro is gonna reside. Now, the 9600 is what's called an old world ROM Mac, which means it first boots into a Macintosh Toolbox ROM before handing control over to macOS by default. Luckily, LinuxPPC ships with BootX, a fully functional graphical bootloader which can run as an extension on classic macOS. It's kinda neat. Basically, you load the kernel and a RAM disk onto the macOS partition, and then BootX allows you to choose whether to hand off control to that kernel at startup, or proceed to macOS. It's technically possible to manipulate the Mac firmware into booting an alternative operating system directly, but from what I can tell, for this distro, most users opted to leave the macOS partition in place and then use macOS to bootstrap the Linux environment directly. That's what I'm replicating today, but I'm using 2 disk images instead of a single disk, since BlueSCSI makes that so easy. You can easily burn this to a CD like I did, but I could also just use BlueSCSI to emulate the CD-ROM drive as well, if I wanted to do this completely without traditional media. I'm starting off with a clean macOS 9.1 install. I've done nothing to this installation other than install Stuffit Expander so I can work with the .sit files used for expanding BootX, and I'm not even sure that's necessary for this particular distro. If you're working with a single drive, you'd probably want to set up your drive so that you have 3 partitions, 2 HFS partitions for Linux and 1 for macOS. In my case, I have my BlueSCSI imitating a dual drive scenario. One drive is dedicated to macOS, and the other I'll partition by going into Applications, Utilities, then going into the Drive Setup folder and selecting the Drive Setup application. From there, I select the not mounted SCSI drive, as that's my second disk image on the BlueSCSI. Going into Custom Setup, I can specify 2 partitions, a larger one for root and a smaller one for swap. It's important to set these partitions as macOS standard and not macOS extended, as the extended partitions can't be recognized by LinuxPPC 1999. My drive setup program has additional AUX options, which would probably also work, but your utility might not, so I'm skipping that for now. Drive setup will warn you that your data on this drive will be destroyed, and once I hit initialize, macOS will do its thing and generate the partitions. Lastly, in Functions, Volume Settings, I need to set these 2 partitions as not auto-mounting on startup. That should prevent errors involving macOS trying to read our Linux data. Now that I've prepped the drive, I can install the programs needed to install the programs needed. And if that sounds convoluted, it's because it is. Basically, LinuxPPC 1999 needs to move the RAM disk and the kernels to the macOS system folder, and install the extension needed to boot Linux at startup. The Q399 ISO, which I'm using, includes an installer that handles this for you, and pretty seamlessly. But if you're using an older install, you might need to manually perform all of those steps. In my case, I just insert the CD, double-click the button, and follow the prompts. After a while, it'll restart the computer, and almost 10 minutes into this flippin' video, I'm finally installing Linux. The initial boot sequence takes about 2 minutes to complete and drops me into a gorgeous WindowMaker Live environment with a step-by-step installer. First, I'll have to format the partitions using pdisk, which is a Linux utility which can partition Mac disks. And yes, Apple shipped this utility for Linux in the 90s. We have to use pdisk from Xterm, which we can get to by clicking on the desktop and selecting Xterm. pdisk-l will read out a list of our disks. And I can see my blank disk with the partitions we made earlier is /dev/sdb. So I load it with pdisk/dev/sdb, pressing enter to get into the dialog. Then I double check I've got the right one with p, which prints out the current partition map. The two partitions I want to delete are 6 and 7, the two untitled partitions we made earlier. I'll start with the larger one, which is going to be the Linux root. I type D6, which deletes the partition, then C6P, which creates a partition at the 6th position on the disk. Then I assign a length in blocks, which should exactly match the listed length we got earlier. Lastly, I assign a name, in this case, root. After this, we repeat the process for the swap partition. Delete the HFS partition, then create a new partition in its place, assign it the same length as the prior partition, and then name it, in this case, swap. This process assigns the actions to perform, which I can confirm with P. But to actually write the partitions, we'll have to press W and then Y through the warning about data loss. After this, it'll take a minute to rewrite the partition map. When it wraps up, we can press Q to exit. Then, in order for the installer to see the new partitions, the instructions recommend restarting at this point. And a couple of minutes and one BootX prompt later, we're ready to proceed. From here, the installation is super easy. Might even be easier than modern Arch. I simply walk through the steps in the graphical installer. From the Select Partitions menu, we designate the partitions we made and allow the installer to format and mount them, taking care to note the root partition, since BootX will use that to boot our root volume later. This'll take a minute. It's a 30-year-old computer. Then we can graphically select packages to install. And in this case, I'm keeping it close to the default, but adding games, documentation, and Vim because Vim broke my brain. Pressing install literally installs the selected packages. See? Arch wishes it was this easy. 4 minutes later, and we're automatically prompted to set a root password. Lastly, I can configure my network, since apparently this doesn't ship with DHCP out of the box. For whatever reason, this dialog gives me no feedback, but I can assure you we're done. We can press Finished to see a cute congratulations screen with credits and everything. Thanks, everybody. On rebooting, I have to set up BootX, the bootloader that LinuxPPC installed on the Mac partition. The default preferences for BootX set it up to run the installer disk, and now that I have a finished installation, I have to tweak a few settings. First, ditch the kernel arguments, then uncheck the box labeled Use RAM Disk, as LinuxPPC is going to be using the installation on the new disk instead. Then I specify that root device, which I copied earlier, in my case, /dev/sdb6. We can hit Save to Prefs to store these variables for the future. And that's it. Hitting the Linux button will boot into LinuxPPC, and in the future, BootX will automatically select this on launch. After a familiar boot screen, we're greeted with an adorable penguin logo and a delightful 90s-era GDM login window. By default, LinuxPPC 1999 is shipping a desktop called the GNU Network Object Model Environment, or GNOME for short. This is rocking GNOME 1.0.4, and for someone who dislikes the current trends towards flat design, this whole thing is a breath of fresh air. The icons have depth, the menu bars don't disappear in front of windows, and you can move the taskbar around. Pretty neat if you ask me, even if it's a little embryonic. KDE is also an option, pre-Plasma, of course. It performs pretty well, but I think the LinuxPPC folks weren't as focused on KDE for this release. It doesn't even have a desktop icon for Netscape labeled Mozilla. Netscape performs great on this monster of a machine, although obviously modern SSL encrypted websites aren't going to work. But HTTP websites load fine, and if you want to enjoy a real web-based blast from the past, ProtoWeb is an extremely fun proxy solution which basically reroutes URLs to cached versions from the Wayback Machine. They also run some services as live content by applying classic design elements to modern information. Like here, for instance, I pulled up a weather.com update from my hometown, and it's updating in real time, but with the classic 90s look and feel. The included games are fun too. Solitaire is always a great time, as is Nibbles, and I'm sure Minesweeper would have been fun if I'd had a 2-button mouse instead of the silly single-button ADB mouse included with the Mac. Now, I wasn't able to get hardware-accelerated graphics working on LinuxPPC 1999, and I think that might be because my ATI Radeon 7000 is a smidge too new for this OS. I think BootX is using macOS's boot environment to render the video in software when you select that no video driver option. And if I had more GPUs or more time to mess with open firmware, I might be able to get even nicer graphics out of this thing. That said, I have to imagine folks weren't usually choosing this for the desktop experience, although it's a perfectly cromulent one. But as a server in 1999, this is pretty sweet. It's a point-and-click installation, and things work pretty well, including Apache, which I might use to host a small website at a VCF someday. Now, I can already hear the comments. But Veronica, why bother with installing Linux on a 30-year-old Mac in the first place? This is a little like asking a gardener why they bother putting seeds in the ground when the grocery store is right there. Sometimes we just do things because we enjoy them. Not everything needs a logical reason. Secondly, though, this is an important part of our computing history, and exploring it for yourself is a fantastic way to connect with the hard work of everyday nerds who crafted the future 30 years ago. If you appreciate the fact that Linux runs on everything here in the roaring 2K20s, you might get something from learning how we got here, and experiencing for yourself the triumphs and tragedies of the turn of the century. But beyond all of that, I think it's important to remind ourselves that we used to own our computers. In an era where our digital devices are increasingly locked down, it's crucial that we remind ourselves that it doesn't have to be this way. I'm increasingly fed up with a modern tech scene that doesn't care about our well-being. And for me, picking up an old computer connects me with a past that felt different. In the same way we might put on a vinyl record to feel more connected with our music. It's an intentional choice. And it's nice to make intentional choices once in a while. My job is to share this stuff with an audience and to explain why it's important. Maybe you grew up with all this stuff and you don't care to go back to it, and that's fine. But I'm also a mom, and I know a lot of young folks today have no idea that we used to own our tech. If you grew up with Apple being the iPad company, seeing this user-serviceable powerhouse of a machine might inspire you. And that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing this. That's what I'm hoping to explain. Yeah, 30 years ago it was complicated to install Linux. It still takes some effort today. But that effort helps us take control of our tech instead of our tech controlling us. That's why this is important. Literally, because Linux is awesome. And so are you. 1, 2, 3, 4. If you're still watching, say, "Nice rant, Veronica," in the comments.